So welcome back for part 2 of the Penny Family History Slideshow. So grab your drink, your single malt scotch, if you will, of a toast. And let's get going. In this episode, we're going to be talking about the pennies in Scotland. From as early as we know, which is sometime in the mid 1600s, until the family immigrates to Canada in the early 1920s. We have a number of old photographs from the latter part of that, and I'll put those up on the screen. And I'll also cover off kind of the history of the ancestors of where they were in Scotland and where they moved around from place to place. During that period, there was World War I, and also the family did make some trips to Canada. Some of the brothers of Alan made some trips to Canada before World War I. So I won't cover off those trips to Canada or World War I in this episode. I'll save that for the next episode. And in this episode, we'll dive into the pennies in Scotland. So let's get going. So let's get into some of the early ancestors. I'll go over this very quickly. The earliest one we can trace is someone named John Penny back in 1685. And it was all around this area over here of the Peterhead, St. Fergus, Longside part of Aberdeenshire. And all of these people were farm laborers of various types. There was John in Longside. He moved to St. Fergus, where the family was for several generations there. And then one of the family members moved back to Longside and then retired in Peterhead. And in the meantime, they had a son, which is really the first one we'll talk about in detail, called James in 1820, born in the Longside area. So diving into greater detail on James, there's James's family tree here. He marries a woman named Sarah Kelman. They have several children, one of which is Robert Kelman Penny, which is my grandfather's father's father, so my great-grandfather's father. James is born in Longside. He moves to Peterhead, where they have the first daughter, moves back to Longside, where they have Robert Kelman Penny, my ancestor, move up to Crimond, where they have another son, and then move over to Lonmay, where they stay. We have various censuses from that time. James initially is working as a cattleman at Mosstown near Lonmay, but then in the next couple of census entries, each 10 years apart, he's a farmer that has 14 acres in 61 and 21 acres in 1871. So he seems to have been the most successful of the pennies to date, or thereafter until they come to the New World. James Penny and Sarah Kelman retired to Old Macar, which is a suburb of Aberdeen, and they retire there, where he's listed as a retired farmer. And their son, Robert Kelman Penny, is there as well. And so this brings us to one of the earliest photos in the family album. This one is from one of the pages of my dad's album, and this corresponds to the family lore. So he has a little question mark here about this photo, but he believes it's John Penny, who's John Clark Penny's father. But the family lore has it he was born in Newcastle. He was a seaman in the whaling trade based in Aberdeen, and he retired in Aberdeen. But none of that seems to be very accurate, in fact. So this is the key piece of information that led me to figure out that the father of Jock Penny was not, in fact, John Penny, and wasn't a whaler at all. This was a form that my dad did not have access to. I was able to look it up online, but it's the form 30A, which is the ocean arrivals form. And there's various information on this form that really confirms that this is Jock's form. And he gives his father down here as Mr. Robert Kelman Penny, living at 1 Presley Place in Inverary. So that's kind of a slam dunk on that. Again, here's Robert Kelman Penny and all of his children. Thanks to the miracles of Photoshop, I can improve that photo a little bit. Anyways, Robert Kelman Penny married Jane Clark, and as was common, they named their first son after themselves. That was quite a common practice. And then here was Sarah Kelman Penny, and recall that Robert Kelman's mother was Sarah Kelman as well. Then there was a James and a Jane Garden, and then John Clark Penny, then Mary Penny, and then Alexander Penny as the youngest son. So a lot of kids. So looking now at Robert Kelman Penny, these were his movements, born in Longside. And then the family moved up to Lawnmay to that farm. Remember, his dad is James Penny, the farmer. He moves very close by where he marries Jane Clark, and they have a number of children there, and then moves closer to the St. Fergus area, and then the Old Deer area, and that's where John Clark Penny, my great-granddad, was born in Old Deer. They moved to Methlick, and again, just a farmer's helper, a cattleman, a farm hand, basically his entire life. And eventually moving into the city as working as a general laborer, and then over to Inverurie, where the family spent time kind of after World War I. They were in Inverurie. Sarah, his wife, dies there. The family immigrates in 1921. He is in Inverurie until I think 1923, and then dies in Old Macar near Aberdeen in 1924. Now, we do have another old photo, this one here with my dad's caption, circa 1900, he reckons. And this is reputed to be John Clark Penny's older brother after his return as a missionary from Africa. So I'm trying to figure out who that might be. It's not Alexander, who's a younger brother. He's got an older brother, James, and another older brother, Robert Kelman Penny, named after his father. I reckon it's Robert Kelman Penny for a reason I'll tell you in a moment. So this is an old photo, a collage that originates with the other David Penny, my third cousin, who's a descendant of Alexander, who's Jock's younger brother. And this is a collage of 4 Robert Pennies. Now someone has cleverly put what looks like a price in old UK currency, 4 shillings and 4 pence in old money, and that in colloquial terms, that's 4 bob and 4 pence, which is 4 Roberts and 4 pennies. David's family lore has it that these people are these people here, and I'm not exactly sure what order this is in, but it's intended that Roy is this fella here. Roy, this guy would be the son of this baby, if that was in fact Robert Thomas or Roy Penny. But the photo looks a bit older than that. This is definitely Robert Kelman Penny. He looks very similar to the photo. And he had a son, Robert Kelman Penny. We definitely know that as well. So here I've taken those photos and put them next to one another. And you can see this is the same fella, I think, by the swoop of the beard, right? I mean, this beard kind of swoops this way and a curve this way and then a weird curve up that way. And this beard does the same thing. It swoops down and then that weird curve up that way. So I'm pretty sure that this fella and this fella, the one identified as the older brother, and this one is the same. And there's only one older brother of Jock, who's named Robert Kelman. This Robert Kelman, I think, is definitely the same as this Robert Kelman. You can just tell by the mustache, the big bushy mustache, I'd say, which look pretty identical. And this little peak of hair up here, which looks a lot like that peak of hair over there. So I believe that's Robert Kelman Penny, and this is Jock's older brother, Robert Kelman Penny, and this might well be the same person. So now let's go and talk about John Clark Penny Sr., also aka Jock, as he went by. This was a photo around 1960. He died soon after that, and married Anne Gavin Ross. And together they raised several children: James, John Clark Penny Jr., Alex Penny, Annie, and Alan Bruce Penny as well. They also raised Anne's son, Malcolm Penny. So then here's my granddad, John Clark Penny Sr. This was a photo of him taken around 1899 at around the time of the Boer War, in which he somewhat participated. Uh, this is the caption that my dad has. It gives his dates of birth and death. And it says he was a sergeant major in the Gordon Highlanders in the National Reserve, formed from the militia during the Boer War. We believe he didn't go to the Boer War, but he trained soldiers for the Boer War as a sergeant major. Now, very interestingly, his birth date that he gave is incorrect. This is what the birth date the family understood it to be. But this is, while the December 3rd is correct, the 1868 is not correct. He was actually born 6 years later than what he told the family. And so there's a question. It wasn't because of the trying to get into the war or anything like that. It was more likely because the first child, James, was born in 1890, which was 2 years before he and Anne got married. So throws into some doubt whether he was actually the father of James or not, because he would have been only been 16 when he was born, when James was born. So either he knocked up Anne at age 15 and when she was 23 and they wanted to hide that, or he adopted James and he wanted to kind of hide the fact that it was really impossible for him to be the natural father. We should note that it's unusual that the second son is named John Clark Penny, not the first. So that lends more credence to that. Also, we have a record from years later in a voter roll where Jim gives his name not as Penny, but as Ross-Penny. But here's an old photo of, this is Alan Penny, and this is Jock over here, and this is Jock's wife, Anne, Gavin Ross here, and this is Uncle Jim with Aunt Winnie around 1960 or so. Leonard Lake, I guess. Anyway, so I don't know. He has a rounder face. Well, most of the pennies have longer faces, although Jock's isn't that long. The pennies have the penny ears, and Jock does as well. Jim doesn't have the penny ears, but he does have a rounded face. It looks a bit like Anne Gavin Ross. So here's some old photographs. Again, I cleaned up that one. This photo is a bit distorted because it's put in a weird frame, an oval frame that bulges out and then has a lens on top of it to give it some sort of a depth to it. But and it's hard to fix that. But this is what he looked like in age 25. He looks a lot like my dad, I think. Here's a photo from 1902. This is Anne and Jock. They were married 10 years before that. And here's a photo from 1918. Again, this is Jock and Anne. This is my grandfather. So this is Alan Penny, born in 1905. So he's age 13 in this photo. And they leave for Canada only 3 years after this photo was taken. So now let's look at the movements of my great-granddad, John Clark Penny Sr. As I mentioned, born in Old Deer to Robert and Jane. The family moves to Methlick, where he's listed as a son in 1881. At a very tender age, around 15 or so, he moves off by himself to Kincardine O'Neill, and he's listed as a farm servant in a household that has no other pennies in it. So he moved off to work. Maybe that was common at the time at that age. Very near Kincardine O'Neill is the town of Birse, where his future wife, Anne Gavin Ross, was born and raised, and where she has a son in 1890, which is 2 years before they get married. Here's the census there listing everyone in that household. You see Alexander Ross, the dad of Anne Gavin Ross, and Anne Ross, the mom. Then she's listed here, another young son. And there's James Ross down there. He's not called Penny at this point. He's James Ross. He's listed as a grandson. We know for a fact he's Anne Gavin Ross's son. There's another granddaughter listed, Missy Ross, as well. We don't know where she came from, but she's actually mentioned later on as well in a letter. They move to Old Macar outside of Aberdeen and get married in 1892, and that's when they have John Clark Penny Jr. And probably their first natural son, and Alex. And then they move up here. He gets a position at the Mains of Naperna in Udny, Elon, Aberdeenshire, where he's a farmhand, I think a fairly senior farmhand. That's where he has his daughter Annie, and my grandfather is born, Alan Bruce Penny. sometime during the war, he's posted down to London, where he actually gets wounded in the war, guarding the Woolwich Arsenal. After the war, him and his family all moved to Inverurie, where he's working as a hammerman, which is a stonemason, and the guy in particular who uses the hammer to crack open the rocks. Annie is listed as a factory worker, and she has her son, Mal, out of wedlock as well. The family immigrates to Canada in 1921. So just some more background on John Clark Penny. This I got from Google Maps Street View. This is the Mains of Knaperna. So it's not a big deal. It's a few little houses on a farm that feeds cattle, obviously. So he was a cattleman. He was in charge of beasts like that. And there's a cottage just over on this side as well, and another one there. So he lived probably in one of these places. My wife and I are actually visiting Aberdeenshire in May of this year. And so we'll drive past here, maybe knock on the door, see if anyone can fill me in on anything more. But that's what it looks like nowadays. And I imagine not too different than what it was back in the day. He rejoined the army and worked as a night security guard, or a security guard in the Woolwich Arsenal in London. This is the front gates to the Woolwich Arsenal, and you see all these smokestacks going back. That's all the Woolwich Arsenal. It was absolutely huge, and they churned out weapons for World War I. So here's a bunch of ladies stuffing gunpowder into bullets, I guess. And there were just factories and factories filled with making all sorts of armaments that was used in World War I. He was injured during a Zeppelin attack. You know, those big balloons. The big balloons with people underneath them floated over, and they dropped bombs out to try to disrupt the war production in the Woolwich Arsenal. And he got caught up in one of those attacks, and the bomb blew up, and it shattered some wood nearby, and the wooden splinters entered his leg. And apparently that wound never healed properly. It required continuous care and periodic hospitalizations throughout his life. So that's bad luck to be hit by a Zeppelin. Here is the birth certificate of their second son, So this wasn't the original son, who was born out of wedlock. This is the second son after they were married, John Clark Penny Jr., to John Clark Penny, who lists himself as a plowman at this point in his life, and Anne Gavin Penny, formerly Ross, in Old Macar, in this case, in Aberdeen. And here's Annie's birth certificate, Anne McKay Penny. And again, this time he's listed as a cattleman. And it's the parish of Udny. So they were at the Mains of Knaperna in Udny, Ellen, Aberdeenshire at this point. And here we have my grandfather's birth certificate, Alan Bruce Penny. And again, still in the parish of Udny. And he's still listed as a cattleman over here as well. So there's Uncle Jim. He's working as a postman. This must have been after World War I, because you can see that his left eye is damaged, and he sustained an injury. And I've got photos of him recovering from that injury during World War I. So he had gone to Canada, Uncle Jim, and come back, and then he had gone to the war and then come back to Inverurie. And here he's working as a postman. And then he goes to Canada again and the States later when the family immigrates as well. So this is, I think, the house where they lived at the Mains of Knaperna. I think if you looked at that older, that more recent photograph, I think you can make out these same two houses off in the distance there. Well, this is the one, it's near Inverurie. He was a stockman, so that it was called the Smith Farm. So I guess it was the Smith Farm at the Mains of Knaperna. Here's Uncle Jack and Uncle Jim. This is the caption my dad has on this photo. This is the Penny House in West Creighton. around, and I don't know where West Crichton is. I've tried searching for it, and I cannot find it in Google Maps at all. Here's Jock Penny's car and his dog and his wash house. That's the caption on the photograph, around 1910. Don't you love the old cars back then? And that's the same car. And that's a Jock at the wheel of the car. We don't know who's in the passenger seat, but that's Annie in the back. You can tell from the cap she wears. She really favors that particular style of cap. And it's obviously a woman of Annie's approximate age. Again, circa 1910, in the 1910s. This is Jim Penny, who's looking quite swish. He made money off in Canada doing various jobs, and I'll get back to that in the next video. But when he got back, he had enough money to have a fine suit, a fine coat, a fine hat, and a fine car. That looks like a fancier car than his dad has anyways. This is Anne Gavin Ross's mom and dad. So that's Alexander Ross and their family dog, and Anne Ross, who's Anne Gavin Ross's mom. And Anne Ross was originally Anne McKay. So that's Anne Gavin Ross's parents, again around sometime in the 1910s. That photo bottom right is a portrait of Anne McKay. And here is Jock on the left, and his father-in-law, Mr. Ross, Alexander Ross, on the right, on an excursion to the Rob Roy Cave at Linnet, again, sometime in the 1910s. So when I say there was no hard feelings, obviously, between the family, you can see them getting along quite well, obviously, going on family excursions together. And I imagine Jock kind of saved the day as far as Annie was concerned, marrying her when she was 25, 26, and she was already with child, and I don't know if it was Jock's child or not. Here is Alan sitting down here. They circled another kid, I don't know why, but that's Alan over there, and here I enhanced it and blew him up. That's definitely looks like my granddad. And this is at the Inverurie Academy higher grade public school in 1911. He was born in 1905, so he was 6 years old. So this is Jack in the back left, and Jim. So remember, Jack is the second child, John Clark Penny Jr., and this is Jim over here in the back right, and this was they had obviously mustered into the Gorton Highlanders, but hadn't yet left for war, mainly because Jim's eye is not yet damaged, and Jack is still alive. And this is Annie over here. Here is Uncle Jack, Uncle Alec, and Jock, again around the same time, 1914. And here's Annie, around 1920, some portraits, studio portraits of Annie. Again, attractive young lady. Now, Annie marries a fella named Bob. We're not sure if that was in Scotland or in Canada, but we think it was in Scotland still, and that they immigrated together to Canada with the rest of the family. But Bob apparently married Annie, and Bob was definitely not Uncle Mel's dad. Uncle Mel's dad was a soldier from Winnipeg. The family legend has it, and who knocked her up and then went home. And one of the reasons they might have come to Canada was to try to track down the biological dad. But again, family lore. And this is Uncle Alec and Annie, the brother and sister pair, in around 1921. And it might have been that Alec and Annie traveled together to Canada as well. So that'll do for part 2. Anyways, that takes us all the way up to the point where the family immigrated to Canada. Like I say, in the next one, I'll cover off more the war years, World War I, and the first trips to Canada by the brothers of Alan. But I hope you enjoyed that. That was enjoyable for me to narrate it, and those are some of the oldest family photos that we have. So cheers, everybody. See you next time.